Good evening, everyone. I'm Christine Bacaressa Balance, and on behalf of the Asian American Studies program at Cornell University, I'd like to welcome you to Critical Refugee Studies, Militarism, Migration, and Memory Work. Tonight, we are deeply honored to have with us three leading scholars of critical refugee studies, an interdisciplinary field that, as the Critical Refugee Studies Collective writes, centers on the refugee, quote, not as object of rescue, but as a site of social and political critiques of US war, foreign policy, and humanitarian efforts. Tonight's panel will discuss the politics and practices that have formed in the wake of US wars and colonialism across Southeast Asia, while also uplifting the scholarly, artistic, and community work of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Hmong communities across the US. Just this past Monday, President Joe Biden and the First Lady made the news for making an unannounced visit to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC, paying tribute to fallen soldiers in honor of National Vietnam War Veterans Day. 2 weeks prior, community groups protested against a March 15th flight set to deport 33 Vietnamese, including those who had come to the US as refugees before 1995. Under the Trump administration, Cambodian nationals saw a 279% increase in deportations, while early last year, Lao and Hmong refugees prepared for a rise in deportations, following the news that the US government was funding a reintegration program to help Laos accept nationals with final orders of removal. According to the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center, or CIRAC, with 2.7 million Southeast Asian Americans currently living in our country, at least 16,000 community members have received final orders of deportation. So in light of the recent shootings in Atlanta and the resurgence of anti-Asian violence across America, Americans of all stripes have been summoned to examine the longer histories of anti-Asian violence enacted across Asia and the Pacific through war, empire, militarism, and even humanitarian efforts. Tonight's panel addresses those calls while also underscoring how critical refugee studies, as a field and an approach, requires us to reimagine how we study and enact migration, movement, and memory work in our world today. A quick thanks to our co-sponsors, the Southeast Asia Program, the Einaudi Center, and Cornell's Migration's Global Grand Challenge Initiative. My special thanks to colleagues Abby Cohen, Shannon Gleason, and Eric Tagliazzocco, as well as our administrative mavens, Alexis Boyce, Eleanor Painter, and Ava White, for all their support in making tonight's event possible. To eCornell staff who are the engine and the wizards working behind the scenes tonight, we give our thanks. And most of all, to Sarah Miners, PhD student in history here at Cornell, emerging scholar of US immigration and refugee history, and this event's co-organizer and moderator. So finally, a quick rundown of our format. The first half of tonight's panel consists of opening remarks and a few rounds of questions for our panelists. In the second half, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, but please feel free to leave any questions in the chat throughout tonight's conversation. We'll also be sharing links to resources discussed during tonight's conversation. So without further ado, I turn it over to Sarah and our esteemed guests.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Professor Balance for that introduction and for inviting me to help organize and moderate this panel. It is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists for this evening. First, I'd like to welcome Yenle Espiritu, Distinguished Professor of Critical Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. A founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, Professor Espiritu has written extensively on Asian American panethnicity, gender and migration, and U.S. colonialism and wars in Asia. Her book, Body Accounts, The Vietnam War and Militarized Refugees, was published by the University of California Press in 2014 and introduced the interdisciplinary field of critical refugee studies, which Professor Balance kindly defined earlier. Next, please welcome Cathy Schlund-Vials, Professor of English and Asian American Studies at the University of Austin, Texas. Professor Schlund-Vials' work brings together Asian American and Asian studies to understand the possibilities, limitations, and contradictions of civil rights, human rights, and state-authorized humanitarianism. Her book, War, Genocide, and Justice, Cambodian American Memory Work, published in 2012 by the University of Minnesota Press, analyzes refugee subjectivity, international law, and human rights with regard to the so-called killing fields era, to establish a backdrop against which to analyze the memory work of 1.5 generation Cambodian American writers, artists, and musicians. Finally, please welcome Ma Vang, Assistant Professor of History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Merced. Also a founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, Professor Vang's research brings critical refugee studies together with critical race theory, critical Hmong studies, and feminist epistemologies. Her book, History on the Run, Secrecy, Fugitivity, and Hmong Refugee Epistemologies, was very recently published, congratulations to Professor Vang, by Duke University Press, and advances a refugee epistemology by analyzing practices of refugee secrecy and fugitivity, which exist against and outside of narratives of youth empire. So thank you to our panelists for joining us this evening. I would now like to invite, as Professor Balance mentioned earlier, our panelists to give a brief 5-minute opening statement. First, we will turn to Professor Espiritu.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your presence at this panel. Even though we can't see you, I trust that you are there. I want to thank Professor Christine Balance for this invitation and to Sarah Miners for moderating the panel. And I'm very honored to be on this panel with Ma Vang and Cathy Schlund-Vials, whose work has been so instrumental for the development of the field. And they both have charted innovative work that we all have been very, very grateful to have. So my remarks will be brief, and I just want to speak a little bit about U.S. wars in Southeast Asia, and then pivot very quickly to a current piece of writing on refugee ingratitude. So U.S. wars in Southeast Asia have been foundational to the Southeast Asian American experience. First, due to U.S. wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the peoples of Southeast Asia entered American consciousness amidst scenes of extraordinary violence and devastation. So the racialization of Southeast Asians took place long before they arrived in the U.S. And there's, of course, is a gender element to this violence, as we can see with the sexualization of Southeast Asian women as often perceived to be sex objects or workers. The second point is the connection between militarism and migration. I'm from Vietnam originally, so my very presence in the U.S. is due to U.S. wars in Vietnam. So we are the living proof of the post-colonial truism that we are here because you were there. And yet, much of official U.S. history about the Vietnam War, and here I'm going to confine my remarks to the Vietnam War because we have two specialists who can speak about Laos and Cambodia. It's about a war that happened to America and Americans, and not about what happened to Vietnamese and Vietnam, and which is, of course, a very painful realization for myself and for many Vietnamese refugees when they don't see themselves in the history of the Vietnam War in the U.S. And yet, Vietnamese refugees become legible as the grateful beneficiary of U.S. gift of freedom, to use Mimi Nguyen's words. In this configuration, Vietnamese refugees constitute the featured evidence of the appropriateness of U.S. military violence in Vietnam. So Vietnamese refugees allow the U.S. to represent itself not as a nation of war, but as a nation of refuge. So critical refugee studies in response to this representation of Vietnamese as always already grateful subjects. So critical refugee studies does two things. One is to underscore the connection between militarism and migration, as I mentioned earlier. And two is to provide a refugee critique of rescue narratives that expect refugees to be forever thankful for being alive, right? For allowing the opportunity to be alive. So how to think about refugee gratitude. So in this piece is a piece that is going to come out in an introduction book that the Critical Refugee Studies Collective is writing. It's called Critical Refugee Studies and Introduction. So this is a chapter from it. So in this chapter, we argue that refugees' gratitude is strategic and performative, that refugees who have minimal power and few resources are self-aware as they play act the relationship and affects required for them to survive and even to thrive. An example that encapsulates this strategic performativity is from the novel On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, so, by Ocean Vuong, which is a beautiful, beautiful text. So in this text, Vuong talks about Vietnamese refugee judicious deployment of the word sorry. So he states that sorry is the most common English word spoken in the Vietnamese nail salon where the narrator's mother worked. For the Vietnamese manicurist, sorry is not merely an apology, it's so much more than that. It's also a word of thanks, but it's primarily a tool one uses to trade in for a generous tip at the end of the manicure. Because, quote, being sorry pays, quote, unquote, and because, quote, the mouth must eat, unquote, the definition of sorry for Vietnamese manicurists morphed into a new word entirely, quote, one that is charged and reused at both power and defacement at once, unquote. So the problem is not that refugees are not grateful, they are, right? As Vinh Nguyen explains, given the innumerable losses suffered by refugees, they do express genuine thanks for getting a second chance of life against the odds, and the odds have been, very, very high against the ability to live. The problem is that for refugees, exhibiting gratitude is often the unspoken condition to acceptance, hospitality, and even friendship, which removes the refugees' agency and dignity. That is, they can only expect acceptance, hospitality, if in return they display appropriate gratitude. So by refusing the link between gratitude and good refugees reclaim gratitude for themselves in saying that this gratitude is mine. And I examine many refugee writing in order to come to that conclusion. So to conclude these remarks, so conceptualizing refugees' performance of gratitude and deference as strategic rather than as misguided underscores the importance of grounding theory on refugees in concrete refugee struggles and refugee lives, tending always to the specific histories and contexts that shape their claims. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now turn to Professor Schlund-Vials for her opening remarks.
So, hello, and I too want to kind of echo what Professor Espiritu has put forth with regard to gratitude. That is not, it's not supposed to be in direct response to her comments, but I am so grateful to Professor Blonce and to Sarah Miners for making all of this happen. I too am just humbled to be part of this panel with Professor Espiritu and Professor Vang. It's just so lovely to see wonderful, smart, amazing scholars at a time where I don't see a lot of people. So it's just phenomenal, and I'm just really looking forward to hearing Professor Vang's comments and also the Q&A. So thank you. I want to actually begin perhaps this is a nice introduction to Professor Vang's work by beginning with that project. So in History on the Run, Secrecy, Fugitivity, and Hmong Refugee Epistemologies, Ma Vang opens with an anecdote concerning a found object. While conducting research in the University of Minnesota's Immigration History and Research Center archive, Vang describes a, quote, half-sheet document, a lost luggage claim form, tucked into one Hmong family's file between the resettlement application forms completed prior to resettlement. Characterized as part of a refugee family's paper trail, Vang subsequently and provocatively engages a metonymic analysis that focuses on the multivalent meanings and vexed histories embedded in a seemingly insignificant record of property loss. As Vang makes clear, these meanings and histories encompass so-termed secret wars, harrowing journeys to Thai borders, uncertain futures in refugee camps, and an overwhelming yet seldom articulated sense of loss that is part and parcel of displaced subjectivity and secreted refugee epistemologies. My short comments take as both inspiration and starting point Vang's nuanced and extrapolative examination of an ostensibly inconsequential artifact to promulgate a related yet divergent method vis-a-vis critical refugee studies, a field that was very much born out of Yenli Espiritu's foundational call for us as scholars to, quote, imbue the term refugee with social and political critiques, that is, to conceptualize the refugee not as an object of investigation, but rather as a paradigm whose function is to establish and make intelligible a wider set of problems, end quote. Taking seriously Espiritu's articulation of refugeness as illustrative operation and using centrally Vang's initial focus on quotidian artifacts, I maintain that refugees as displaced subjects are, despite Giorgio Agamben's oft-accessed analytic, not emblems of states of exception, nor are they merely the victims of collateralized militarization. Rather, such refugee formations militate against symptomatic assessments of unprecedented crisis and spectacular violence via an alternative capacity to diagnose the operational mundaneness of the U.S. imperial project. This turn towards a diagnostic critical refugee studies is on one level an attempt to dialogically engage with disability studies, an interdiscipline that offers productive ways to interrogate the ableist discourses of rehabilitation, access, and repair entrenched in past-present humanitarian politics. On another level, to diagnose an issue suggests an origin point and pivots on the discovery of cause based on a close reading of symptoms. In eschewing a refugee as symptom analysis to a refugee as diagnosis analytic, I purposefully resituate displaced personhood and knowledge from the periphery to the center. Such recalibrations often involve considering the processes, paperwork, and procedures required to prove one's refugee status, laying bare what Chandan Reddy has recently termed a regime of administrative violence with regard to rights denial and disavowal. They also include personal artifacts and objects that attest to a longue durée relationship to conflict prior to and after displacement for refugee subjects. It likewise accommodates for the quotidian dimensions of U.S. militarism, which rely on bureaucratic apparatus of timetables, flight plans, orders, and memos. Last but certainly not least, this alternative engagement makes possible a transhistorical comparative evaluation that is consonant with what Slate reporter George Packer maintained was the insidiousness of Donald Trump's recent refugee policy, which he provocatively terms bureaucratic sadism. So I'll just conclude with that awful term. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for your opening remarks. And we will now turn to Professor Vang.
Thank you so much. I'm just really excited to be on this panel. Thank you, Professor Schlund-Vials, and then Sarah Miners for inviting me to participate. I am so privileged to be on this panel with two wonderful scholars and mentors in Professor Espiritu and Professor Schlund-Vials. So I want to begin by sort of, I want to make 2 points and then I'll end. So my work intervenes in Hmong historiography and subject formation to eliminate how U.S. empire and militarism operate by recruiting allies globally, and to center, and then on the other hand, to center refugee knowledge in critical refugee and ethnic studies research. So, in doing so, my work rethinks the refugee beyond its legal definition as outlined in the UN Convention on Refugees in 1951, right, which really determines the who can be a refugee based on a kind of notion of well-founded fear, right? But fear that is very much tied to the state. And so this reconceptualization of the refugee as a figure and as a subject whose actions illuminate war, race, and violence, as Professor Espiritu establishes in her book, Body Counts, translates in my research to assert the refugee as a site and producer of knowledge. So rather than treating the refugee as either an object of rescue or a protected legal status that can further exclude a wide range of displaced populations from seeking asylum, I argue that we must believe the stories of those who are forcibly displaced. And it's often groups seeking asylum for racialized, gendered, and or sexual violence, as well as the effects of global racial capitalism and environmental destruction that do not fit the narrow humanitarian refugee designation. So, my first point that I want to make answers the question, how do we engage with the refugee in order to speak back to empire and militarism, in this case, U.S. empire in particular? And here I'm going to introduce the idea of Hmong soldiering for the U.S. as a form of colonial militarized violence, and as that which also does the work of state violence. And so, I do this work in the book. So as I argue in the book, Hmong refugee history is oriented around having to be on the run as an act and as an epistemic assertion to maneuver colonialism, militarism, and state violence and erasures. So Hmong were forcibly displaced across the different geopolitical borders of China and Southeast Asia under the overlapping Chinese, French, Japanese, and US American imperial powers. And this inter-imperial history meant that Hmong have had to navigate the relationship to imperial rule and state governance to insist on their sovereignty and self-determination. So that Hmong resistance to imperial and state governance also informed their complicated relationship to state violence, as an ally even at times. So in Laos, from where the Hmong American population was displaced, Hmong resistance to French imperialism and American liberal militarized empire also constituted dissent against the Lao monarchy and anti-colonial leaders who were sympathetic to these imperial powers. And so then they were recruited during the Secret War to ally with the US, right? To aid its imperialist war in Vietnam to stop communism. And, and thousands followed or were coerced to join the right-wing Ling-Ning Hmong leader General Wang Pao, who was recruited by the U.S. via the CIA to engage in one of the largest clandestine military operations in U.S. history, U.S. CIA history. So, this was, we're around in the time of the Vietnam War, right? And it was so-called a secret war because it was in violation of the 1954 and then subsequent 1962 Geneva Conventions, which stipulated against foreign military intervention into, the sort of former Indo-Chinese countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And so the CIA's secret army, which also included Mien, Khmer, Ka, and Lao peoples, peaked at more than 30,000 soldiers and operated in northeastern Laos to combat North Vietnamese troops operating in the region. So in essence, they were the new Friends of Freedom in relation to the racialized North Vietnamese army. Yet this new friend status did not negate Hmong as racial others. So Hmong sojourning for the U.S. established a colonial ally relationship grounded in the project of modernization. And indeed, the colonial trope of not having yet emerged in modernity, because Hmong do not have a nation state, racialized this group as out of time and space. And sojourning as a nation-building project aimed to enfold Hmong into the Lao state and colonial modernity. So that the post-colonial Cold War conflict capitalized on Hmong sojourning to disrupt Laotian decolonization and undermine Hmong political movements for sovereignty. And Hmong allyship with the US military led to their forced displacement, right? Where after fleeing to refugee camps, tens of thousands eventually relocated to the US. And so Hmong sojourning as an ally to state violence is hidden by the fact that it was done under US imperialist and state secrecy. Hmong history, refugee history in particular, is as much about sojourning as it has been about what Hmong studies scholar and critical ethnic studies scholar Kong Peng Pak aptly describes as structural eradication within US history from the American imagination through war and militarism, where Hmong Americans have been effaced by US imperialism and racism. And this effacement has enabled Hmong American experiences of racial violence to be evidence for conflating or dispelling the model minority myth. And so, I contend that Hmong erasure reveals how this myth has always been used to enact state violence as, a kind of ally as well. And so my second and related point that connects Hmong sojourning to an investigation of state violence and how it connects Hmong American experiences, and by extension, that of refugees and Asian Americans to those of Black Americans and the movement for Black lives, right? I really want to take the opportunity to think about what does sojourning for the U.S. mean, and how can we, from that position, investigate how state violence operates relationally. So Hmong soldiers who were later displaced, right, was a complicated history that continues to teach us about the work of militarized imperial power and its connections with domestic racist policing. And bridging insights from critical refugee studies and critical ethnic studies, my colleague Kit Myers and I recently wrote an essay on Tu Tao, the Hmong American officer who was involved in the murder of George Floyd, and in which we argue that Tao can be a state-sanctioned murder. In fact, he was called to do so through the convergence of US police and imperialist structures that demanded his active silence as a new friend of freedom. And that this new friend is embodied in the figure of the Hmong soldier who became a refugee after the war and whose supposed lack of self-determination justifies not only the violence of US empire and policing, but also facilitates participation in those very acts of violence. And I won't rehearse, the details of Floyd's murder, but to say that there were 4 police officers involved, right? And we are currently actually witnessing the trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed Floyd by pressing his body and his knee against Floyd's neck. But one of the 3 officers who did not intervene was Tu Thao. And so looking at Thao, who comes from a refugee and Hmong American community with the history of militarized violence, reveals how state violence works. Thao's positionality as an officer parallels local and national efforts to diversify the police force and serve the community he represents. Nevertheless, he operates within this white supremacist police state, so that Thao's recruitment and work as a Minneapolis police officer is consistent with the U.S. imperialist practices to recruit Hmong as proxy soldiers during the secret war. And so, I have more comments on this that I'm going to expand on in the question and answer part. But I want to leave enough time for that and not go too deeply into it. But I also want to point out that, and what I want to say later is to discuss how Hmong American activists refuse this reprised role of the ally in their activist work to insist on justice for Floyd, for other Black people who have been killed by the police, and then also, against the ongoing anti-Asian racism. So I will end there.
Thank you, Professor Vang. I definitely don't want to curtail this topic of discussion, and I would actually like to invite Professor Schlund-Vials and Professor Espiritu to also comment on these points. And so just to give my question a frame, I would just like to ask if all 3 panelists could expand on the connections between empire or interventions abroad and how refugees are racialized in the US and why it is important to make these kinds of connections, which you all begin to address in your opening statements, but I think it's very vital that we continue this point in the open Q&A. So just to give Professor Vang a chance to breathe, why don't we now turn to Professor Espiritu, if you would like to make a comment on this point.
Yes, as I began with my remarks, I think that it's important to think about how Americans first encounter Southeast Asia, and I think of it as through the TV news. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, and so that images of violence have always been attached to Southeast Asian bodies, or images of devastation, like refugees, on the boats, and like the iconic images of the boat refugee people in particular, or of the Vietnamese refugee being rescued through the helicopter. So all of those images comprise how the majority of Americans come to quote unquote know. And I'm just going to speak primarily about Vietnamese refugees. Before I say that, I also want to say that the Vietnam War is a misnomer, because in fact the war was not confined to Vietnam. It spread to Laos and Cambodia, but the term Vietnam War in and of itself is a process of erasure. So thinking about the racialization of Southeast Asia, both the space of Vietnam as well as the bodies of people from Vietnam have been linked to linked as well as frozen in time, so, and there's so many examples that we can share, that I can share personally about what, when I say I'm from Vietnam, which I seldom say. When I get the question of where you're from, I never answer and make people go down the list. Are you Chinese? No. Are you, and then they're so surprised that I don't give them their desired answer. But if I ever say that, then they were like, you can just see a string of signifiers in people's head. Oh yeah, I remember watching that movie about you. I had a mom who said, a mom meaning a mom of one of my children's friends, say, why don't I take you out to dinner, you can tell me all about it. And so, so there's like this a string of signifiers attached to the place and the body of Southeast Asians. And I think that missing in the discussion and media news about the murders in Atlanta, and these women are not from Vietnam, but they are working class immigrant women, and because the Korea War was also a very visible war in U.S. memory, and so the sexualization of Asian women and the equating of Asian women with being submissive and being practitioners of care work, which is often translated to sex work, whether or not that is the case, is something that the media haven't really spent a lot of time with. And I do think that Asian Americanists who take on the issue and then lump it as Asian American issue is also doing a disservice to the militarization component of this and to the working class nature of care work that many working class Asian immigrant women and refugee women have to do. For the Vietnamese community, the care work is the nail salon, and it's it's a kind of work that it's not necessarily something that people necessarily wanted to do, but it is, it's a kind of work that performs care for the customer. So I'll stop there.
So Sarah, that's a very robust question. And I think that it's a question that was very much embedded in all of the presentations that just occurred by way of this panel. But I do think that there is something peculiar about Asian American studies and its connection to critical refugee studies, because I think that what operates as a through line is that we as scholars first found our way in ethnic studies and Asian American studies, and now we have shifted to critical refugee studies. So in thinking through that, I want to first, kind of get to some of the resonating issues between those two fields and then go to the issue of empire, militarization, and racialization. But if in Asian American studies, and this is an admittedly antiquated, kind of founding moment, but if integral to Asian American studies and Asian Americanist critique is a negotiation of model minoritization, one way to read model minoritization is in terms of its probationary racial status vis-a-vis whites and white supremacy, right? So the model minority subject is a probationary white subject that can easily transform into a perpetual foreign subject, right? So that it's a very tenuous probationary status. And if we think about refugees are likewise probationary insofar as they can be, quote, granted asylum, but that doesn't mean that they're naturalized into the U.S. body politic. Instead, it is very easy to denaturalize and deport refugees because they are not afforded citizenship status. So we already see that, what makes a through line is like kind of a probationary personhood that is ultimately dictated by logics of white supremacy and U.S. empire. So shifting to kind of the Cambodian case, right, and the Killing Fields era, what really drew me to that project outside of a personal, I am Cambodian American, was the degree to which the Killing Fields served as a constant, event that was raised by U.S. presidents to justify intervention. Yet very little attention was paid to Cambodian refugees who were kind of negotiating very difficult circumstances at times, who were engaging activist work. It was as if, in many ways that the Killing Fields was the event that happened that served as a justification for further intervention. But the Cambodian refugees who came here were disappeared, right? So it was really about the politics and the polemics without the body. And I think that is actually one of the interventions that Professor Espiritu makes early on, right? Which is this idea, why is it that refugees are always spoken for, but nobody really kind of speaks about the centrality of refugees vis-a-vis these other discourses around foreign policy, imperialism, racialization, et cetera. So, I'll stop there.
Yeah, so it's I completely agree with everything that Professor Espiritu and Professor Schlund-Vials has, stated. And I think that what's so interesting in this moment, and I think that perhaps, well, I can't say I've always known, but, to think about like the beginning to do this work and always, and I also think back to graduate school, like, why is it important to do this work, right? And now I'm just beginning to, and part of it is the world that we're living in now, which is unrelenting in the violence, in everything. And so what I think that, we're trying to think through is how do we engage in deepening an understanding of how systemic racism works, both domestically, right, but then also through U.S. interventions, imperialist and military interventions, and then how that complicates Asian American racialization, if we're talking about Southeast Asian refugees in particular, right? And because of I guess who I am and the work that I do in Hmong studies, there's always been a kind of uneasiness, right, about my place within Asian American studies. Not because I don't claim to be Asian American, but the narrative that I want to tell, I didn't. It couldn't be told in the frameworks only of Asian American studies, I guess, right? And so I think that's why critical refugee studies has been such a illuminating way to engage in this work to highlight the complexities of how do you talk about the history of, how do you talk about people and their knowledge when you have to begin to talk about their history, right? Because there hasn't been much written on it. And then to begin to talk about that history, how do you even do that when it's been kept systematically, kept silent or secret? And so, for me, thinking about going back to the notion of effacement, right? What gets effaced, and which has always been the narratives, the stories of refugees, the cultural productions of refugees, and then what remains hyper visible to bolster U.S. exceptionalism about refugees, right? That whether they are grateful or that they are allies, they have been allies, right, to the U.S. And that narrative continues to be hyper visible because it bolsters U.S. exceptionalism. And then, for Hmong refugees and Hmong Americans in particular, to the difficulty of grasping, well, then, what other kind of frameworks can we think about highlighting this history of, this is why I think about, a history on the run, right? In the sense of that not to privilege nation state, but to privilege people who have had to be on the run because of state violence and colonial violence. And then from there, how do we make connections or build or see connections to other people, other groups who have also experienced state violence? And I think, so going back to the, how critical refugee studies thinks through and I think intervenes in the seeming separation between empire abroad and racialization in the U.S. is that, you know, and why I highlighted the George Floyd case and Tao's involvement, because I, you know, absolutely was, I was uneasy both in terms of Tao's involvement, right? But then also in Floyd's murder, but also uneasy about the sort of Asian American response to Tao, in the sense that the only way to understand him is as Asian American and as whether or not he is the model minority, right? And the ongoing attempts to dispel that or to assert that, and then the move to assert, you know, especially the Hmong community and the Twin Cities, whether or not they are the new model minority, right? Because they are the primary Asian American community in that state. And so, you know, it became a way to, you know, how do we think through this without falling into these existing categories that we can't actually, that doesn't serve us, right? And so, you know, the work of, and then to interrogate, then, you know, interrogate what has always been hyper visible so that we can get at the things that have been effaced, that actually have always been there.
Thank you for that thoughtful response. I'm in total grad student mode and frantically taking notes. And I was struck by something you said about how to talk about or remember refugee experiences or histories, such as they are. And I would like to sort of redirect that into another meaty, broad question for our panelists about how cultural productions or community and diaspora would help different generations make sense of both violence, state violence, refugee displacement, but also belonging. And sort of the flip side of that question is, what are the challenges or limits of memory work for various refugee generations or populations? So if we want to go in order again, otherwise, if someone is really raring to go, I will turn it over to Professor Espiritu.
Yeah, I can say a few words. In critical refugee studies, we really think about how to enact, not only to state, but also to actualize the idea that refugee stories are a site of theory making. So, you know, we say this, but in the introduction book that we're writing, we're really trying to figure out, and it's not easy to do. So how does refugee storytelling allow for new forms of knowledge to be produced? And how is it a site of producing new ways of seeing? And so I can just speak about the chapter that I just shared briefly with you. So originally this chapter was going to be about a refugee critique of humanitarianism. And so usually when we do that kind of critique, and many people have done this, you know, this is a robust field with really, really good work. But it always begins with the critiques, and it begins with power, and it begins with theorists. And it just did not feel to me as I was writing this that I was writing something new. And Ma and I and our colleague Lang Yung, who is also in the collective, and we thought about this many times. And, you know, one of the things that the refugee, that our collective tries to do is to create new critical vocabularies. So eventually we decided that what we are really talking about is refugee ingratitude and gratitude. And so the chapter pivots around those concepts that then feature refugee stories and words and experiences rather than those of the humanitarian workers. And so again, it's, you know, it is to really think strategically in writing how to do this kind of work, so that refugee stories become, as we always say, at the site of theory making. And I think that once I figured that out with my colleagues, it was fun. like it's like I flipped the power structure of the work, and move it, and just begin with the refugee, as we often say. How do we just begin with refugees' words? Why do we always have to couch it in something, And that's like our colleague Nigel Hatton, who always reminds us that what does it mean to begin with refugees? And I also think that, people always say, well, what can we do? What should we do? That's kind of perennial question. And the question always, to me, is also assumes that there's just one easy answer, because there isn't. But I think one way to do this is to, as we also say in that collective, to flood the world with refugee stories. And, is to move away from that single story of, the racialized subject that is subject to violence and that is always linked to violence, and displacement and devastation, and, all of which implies some kind of primitivity that is, linked to the naturalized zone of danger. They think about the jungle, right? It's a very racialized term. Like people say, at that time when they were going to Vietnam, we had to go to the jungles, So yes, I think that refugee memory work is very, very important, because in the sense that it has this possibility of creating new theories, new ways of seeing.
I think that, my response to the question will actually tie into what Professor Espiritu just mentioned in her response, and also Professor Vang by way of effacement. And I think that in terms of memory work, what really guided me to think about this term is that James Young, who's a Holocaust, cultural studies person, right, the scholar, actually uses the term to interrogate the efficacy of Holocaust memorials, because there is an assumption that memorials and monuments tell one story that's inclusive. But actually, the efficacy of a memorial in particular is to not only highlight who is commemorated, but also who gets to commemorate and who's missing from that commemoration. So it's actually about engendering or instantiating debate over an event, as opposed to providing a final story about that event. But with that said, in my work with Cambodian American 1.5 generation artists, what was really striking is, how do you tell the story of a genocidal past that is both acknowledged and forgotten, and does not have the benefit of state-sanctioned justice? There is never, until recently, and this just concluded in the last 2 years, there was no tribunal. We're not going to have a Nuremberg. This is not something that's going to be legislated by way of the Civil Rights Act, right, of 1988, which at least outlines a plan for Japanese American incarceration redress, right? So what exactly is the role of a Cambodian American artist when faced with those realities? What does that artist do if that artist wants to do memory work, right? And it actually shifted the focus for me from, and this corresponds to Professor Espiritu's argument, it wasn't so much that this is a traumatized population that is struggling to remember its past, but rather it was a population who was engaged in an imaginative, kind of process, an imagine otherwise, because they could not find ways to commemorate within state-sanctioned systems, if that makes sense, right? So if we think about it that way, we actually see that what seemed to be a narrative of trauma is now a profound story of resistance that recalibrates refugeeness, again, from the periphery to the center, right? So, I think that, that is an important facet of memory work, but I find it telling that Professor Balance began with the acknowledgement that President Biden and First Lady Biden visit the Vietnam Memorial, and the debates are still not being, they visit the memorial, and it's kind of taken as a first premise that this is about the American, kind of participation in that conflict, despite the fact that we are dealing with all of these calls to end Asian American hate, right? So that I think that fully illustrates the kind of strategic forgetting and tactical remembering that takes place.
I'm going to pick up where Professor Schlund-Vials left off in terms of the forgetting and the remembering that happens together, right? And I think for me, this question of memory has always been central to the work and how I think about refugees, primarily because I think that refugees have always been telling stories, right? And they have not been heard, not because, we don't listen, but we don't listen in the way that, so that we can hear, right? And, I think about my father who's always telling stories, but I always just took those as stories, right? Until I grew up and went to grad school. And then, of course, I grew up again and got a job. But and then realized, those are actually his not just random stories, but his knowledge that because there is nowhere else we can access those stories, right? And so how do we privilege that, bring that front and center. And then it kind of, for me, it's, that refugees, but then also children of refugees, right, have also been telling stories in different ways. And this gets to the question of literary and cultural productions, right? And so, it's quite interesting that in my work, I'm drawn to, of course, I do archival and then, interviews, but I'm also very drawn to literature and poetry in particular. And and so, using poets, like my Vang's work, but then even other poets, this introduction that Professor Espiritu mentioned, poets from other migrant refugee groups, Salvadorian refugee groups. So Felix Aguilar, and then Tracy K. Smith, who was a National Poet Laureate. Right. And so the poetry about displacement and about what it means to try to gain entry as, a migrant or a refugee, that these are powerful stories, and they're powerful narratives that speak back to legal regimes, speak back to state power, and then on the other side of that is the forgetting. One of my colleagues mentioned to me recently, in which he said, and he's a filmmaker who has done documentary films on refugees, is that the folks that he's talking to want to forget, right? And so the question is, how do you do a film on forgetting that is a documentary film, right? And so there's all these kinds of instituted erasures, right? And that's the other part that's so important and powerful.
Thank you to all of the professors. Just before we move into questions from the audience, I want to return to a point that Professor Vang raised in her opening statement, when she talked about the Hmong community and Asian American activism in the movement for Black Lives, and also the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. So I'd just like to ask broadly if any of you would like to add to the point of how refugees and their communities are mobilizing around these issues, anti-Asian hate crimes, but then also the continued deportations across several presidential administrations. and also how refugees or Southeast Asian activists are requiring that we think differently about these issues, as Professor Espiritu mentioned with regard to the Atlanta shootings.
Ma, I think you should go ahead because you have a lot really wonderful things to share about the Floyd case and the efforts for solidarity.
Okay, I will expand on that where I left off in the opening remarks, and and part of the essay on the George Floyd murder is, this problem of how do we understand refugees and Hmong Americans, right? And then how state violence works relationally in terms of policing and recruitment to participate in police or the military. And then the other part is to think about, well, what are the intersections of solidarity or resistance, right? And so thinking through this notion of and I actually take my cue from a lot of Hmong women, Hmong American women activists, right? And in particular, who have expressed calls for justice for Black lives, stating that Hmong liberation is tied to Black liberation, such that systemic change to value Black lives will also benefit Hmong Americans as a racial minority in the US, right? And then there was a statement by a Milwaukee-based Hmong American Women's Association released soon after on May 31st, in which they state, and I quote, "We stand with Black women and in our solidarity are committed to ending violence against Black folks. We understand and believe that our fight for liberation of Southeast Asian women is directly connected to the liberation of Black women." End quote. And so, it really, I think, these moments tend to be lost, right? And when so much of the media attention and the narratives focus on who the perpetrators are, and then dehumanizing the person who has been murdered, right? And so I think that these calls and the ways in which community activists are working, trying to build connections with each other across communities is really, really powerful. And I'll just end. I want to actually say a quote from a Hmong woman who is the mother of Phong Lee, who was a Hmong youth who was also killed by police in Minneapolis, but in 2006. And she actually came out during the initial rallies in Minneapolis, and she said, and I quote, "I know that there's nothing else in this life to assuage my pain at all. I know that when it was my son, Black people aligned with us, and it didn't matter day or night. They were with us at all times. And this murder is what hurts the most, and we must join them." And then she later, in a different interview, describes the video footage that was shown to her of her son's killing. And she says, and I quote, "In that moment, I knew that my child had surrendered 100% with his hands raised, and they shot both his hands. Right after they shot him, it looked like the video was cut because the next moment showed a gun next to his body. This was something that showed the police that the police, can take away our lives because they do not see us as valuable people," end quote. And so I think there's so much cross. I don't necessarily, not that African Americans' experiences and Hmong American experiences are commiserable, right? But that there's something there in terms of the way that state violence works to make lives expendable, whether through policing, specifically through policing in this case, or through U.S. military violence. where, threads in which we could see, forms of solidarity or resistance taking place.
Could I just add a couple of things, or should we move on? It's up to you.
Perhaps just a few moments of further remarks, but I do want to leave plenty of time for audience Q&A.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that it's important to also remember that Southeast Asian refugees were resettled in under-resourced communities, and many of their neighbors are Black and brown folks. That's different from Asian American suburban experience. And the second thing is that many Vietnamese first generation people do not speak English. So one of the activists type of work that Vietnamese Americans are doing is to translate Black Lives Matter materials into Vietnamese and publish that in the Vietnamese language newspapers. Very, very concrete thing to do. Otherwise, people don't know what's going on because it's all in English.
Thank you for those additions. Professor Balance, I would like to now turn it over to you for audience Q&A.
Thank you, Sarah. So panelists, we have a number of questions here in the chat that have come up. I'll start with the first question, which is actually from Brian Sangdala, who is a PhD student studying Cambodian American musical cultures and memory work. And he has a kind of broad question that hopefully everyone can answer. How do you find the balance between historical report, right, that is widely unknown in this country, or as Professor Schlund-Vials mentioned, and Professor Espiritu mentioned, is known, right, from a US-centric point of view. So how do you find the balance between that and trauma porn, right, especially when you write or present? And it could just be in the writing and presentation, but also, experiences maybe in Q&A sessions, right, which might bring up some of these tensions.
Well, I think that, this is something that I've thought a lot about because, in giving talks, I think the tendency within any discussion about the Khmer Rouge period or the Killing Fields era is to show photographs of awfulness, right? Like mounds of skulls. It becomes very much an exercise in atrocity tourism, right? Because in many ways, that is the legibility of Cambodia within a larger U.S., imaginary. And I think that balance in the question itself highlights an ethical engagement with the material that must be maintained, right? So I really want to commend the perspective there. I also think that in terms of thinking through one's subjects, and I know that my colleagues on this panel both think through this, is that it's very easy to delimit a subject's life to the period of trauma or conflict and then after. But these are individuals who had full lives prior, right, to war, and this was something that I actually learned from my mother, of all people. I don't know why I put it out there. I love her. I'm really into my mom. But I'm adopted, and my mother is a Japanese, a Japanese woman, and she was 11 years old when the bomb at Nagasaki was dropped. She lived about 20 miles away. So she has that memory of World War II, right? And she came to the United States, et cetera. But she would be horrified if the entirety of her life began and ended with that 1945 bombing. Instead, when she speaks to me, it's actually a fully actualized person. So I just want to kind of highlight that part of what critical refugee studies does, and this is something that Professor Espiritu really kind of articulated early on, is that the quote, like the trauma porn or like the voyeuristic gaze, that is actually part and parcel of how the refugee is something that is spoken about, right, or conceptualized as a thing and not as a person.
Professor Espiritu, Professor Vang, did you want to respond?
I agree absolutely with Professor Schlund-Vials. And I think that if you start with the refugee, you more than likely will not get to trauma porn, because that's not how people see themselves, and that's not how they narrate their life stories. One of my undergraduate students is doing a project that looks at food and gardening among Vietnamese refugees, to think about them as, again, knowledge producers and knowledge holders. So the questions about, she doesn't ask about questions about their experiences with the war. It comes up, when they talk about food or they talk about something else, but it isn't the central part of who they are. And they also narrate the war differently. And I always remind people that, even during the war, people fall in love, they read poetry, they play soccer, it's like everyone else. And so the reduction of refugees, into the R, with the R refugee category, is really the fault of the person who does the research. I think that if you start with the refugee, that's not how they're going to narrate their life stories.
Professor Vaughn?
No, I just want to say I completely agree. And I, maybe in the interest of time, I will hold comments.
Okay, that's no problem. Actually, this question is for me and for Professor Espiritu specifically, just knowing about, something you had said earlier, right, in terms of the misnomer of the Vietnam War, right, as this kind of war that only took place in one country or between, right, two countries, and really needing to understand how it impacted the region. I wondered if you could speak more about a recent work or recent article that looks at the kind of refugee camp in the Philippines, right? And its relationship to not just Philippine nationhood, but also in particular indigenous communities there, right? And so maybe ways in which we can start to think through or trouble, right? Expand first, maybe U.S. empire, right, on the run, or its kind of expansiveness. And then the ways in which it brings different types of Asian American communities into conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think this is a component of what I mean in critical refugee studies. To say refugee is the site of knowledge production as a critical site of exposing U.S. empire. And I often say that when I started this project, I thought of the Vietnam War and Vietnamese refugee as a dyad. It's between Vietnam and the U.S. But in fact, as I did the research, and I published this in Body Counts, it isn't the case. It involves basically the constellation of the U.S. empire in the Asia-Pacific region, including the Philippines, Okinawa, and also Thailand, which I didn't write about, but on, Guam and Hawaii and so on. So all of those nodes of the U.S. empire in the Asia-Pacific have to be activated in order for the Vietnam War to take place. And so I think that in this article that you mentioned, I talk about how Vietnamese refugees who were temporarily resettled in the Philippines. And so this was part of it's called the Philippine Refugee Processing Center. And one of the reasons that occurred was because of the history of of U.S. colonialism in the Philippines. And but what when I visited the sites much later, and going through the newspaper archive, I saw this headline that says, the local indigenous population was displaced in order to create this refugee camp for Vietnamese refugees. So this is the basis of the article, is that in refugee resettlement, even though the U.S. took on the credit of being the rescuer, in fact, it also required a constellation of countries and peoples in the Asia-Pacific region in order for that to take place. So in the Philippines, it required the Philippine agreement with the U.S. And also then the Philippine government in turn exacted its power against its indigenous population by removing them in order to literally replace the people there with the Vietnamese refugees. And the situation was very dire, so that literally across the river is where the indigenous population was moved to, and they could not access the school, they could not access healthcare, they could not access a lot of the resources that were provided for the Vietnamese refugee, because the Philippine government did get funding from the UN and the Philippines, the US and other Western countries to do that kind of work. Because so what the Philippines did for the US was to basically check out, rehabilitate and make sure that the US only gets the good refugees. So they also do that work for Empire.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Espiritu. I think in a related fashion, there's a question here for Professor Schlund-Vials, right? And thinking again about the kind of ways in which critical refugee studies as approach as a framework can be in conversation, right, with other fields. So questions from Anita Manor: in what way does this topic, right, or this critical refugee studies allow or demand more engagement with disability studies? You mentioned it in your opening statement, and we'd just love to hear more about how you're thinking through this connection.
Thank you to Professor Manor, who is close colleague, respected colleague, and best friend, let's be honest. I think, though, in terms of disability studies, like what drew me to think about this is that when we talk about refugee subjectivity in a master narrative, oftentimes there is a discourse around the broken body or the impaired body becoming whole again once granted asylum, right? And I started thinking about what is it about the terms around humanitarianism that actually assume a very problematic ableist relationship to the refugee subject. And why is it that disability studies and critical refugee studies, or I should say disability studies and Asian American studies, are not more in conversation with one another? So in looking at disability studies, and I'll be quite honest, it's something that is quite personal to me, given that I am a disabled subject. I started thinking more concretely about what it means for accommodation, access. The nomenclature that is very familiar within disability studies seemed quite resonant with what was required of refugees by way of entry, et cetera, right? And it was actually that turn to disability studies that prompted a rethinking away from spectacularized violence and these kind of event-oriented engagements, and instead forced me to think about the daily and the everyday, right? So it's not just about these important events in a refugee's migration from one place to the next. What exactly is the daily negotiation? And disability studies is actually like an interdiscipline that takes on the quotidian, that takes on the mundane, that assumes that one's access is not necessarily given, and that access is very much about negotiating the everyday and the real. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it was really that, and I'm drawing a phrase from Professor Espiritu here in conceptualizing critical refugee studies. Even though I'm saying, critical refugee studies and disability studies should be more conversant, they are actually conversant by way of critical juxtaposition. And that's one of the other disciplinary calls put forth in critical refugee studies, is that you should not limit yourself to a sociological reading, a literary reading, or an anthropological reading of refuginess. What is most productive is a combination of fields, a dialogic engagement of fields that are normally not conversant with one another. It forces you to kind of go beyond. And I think that, that's exemplified in body counts, where, we have somebody who's trained as a quote sociologist, but I would argue that that book is very much historical. It's about various narratives, and these are things that are never conversant with one another.
Can I add to what Professor Schlund-Vials says, just because it's such a amazing project that you're working on in terms of thinking about the intersections of disability studies and critical refugee studies. And you know, as you're talking, it made me think about, I was like, absolutely, oh my gosh, why is this not something that we have talked about? Because I mean, the literal bodies of refugees, whether it's by participating as a soldier in war, or whether it's because they have to escape war, that refugee bodies become disabled bodies, right? And so, and I mean, just, you know, sort of anecdotally, the ways in which refugees engage with the state, not both in terms of legal status, but also access to services and resources, right? And the language, and as you said, the language of accessibility and accommodation is not one that refugees use. It's a different kind of language, right? So how do we sort of, you know, bring these conversations together that don't speak together, but actually are, you know, have been at the very sort of level on the ground. So anyway, fascinating. I'm so excited.
Yeah, and I think, again, to go back to Professor Espiritu's, you know, the recent publication, you know, just the language of the rehabilitation, right? Which, again, kind of holds within it an ableist notion, right, of personhood attached to refugees. Okay, the final question from the audience from Sabine Ahmed. What are the resonances, or perhaps more interestingly, divergences, do you see between critical refugee studies and critical border studies? I might also add perhaps the kind of pressures, again, that critical refugee studies puts on fields such as critical migration studies, right? So are you seeing resonances or divergences between these various fields, particularly in terms of theoretical frameworks of analysis? And maybe that's a question for each of you all.
I can take that one. I'm currently from the work with looking at indigenous displacement of indigenous groups in the Philippines. I'm really interested in thinking about the question and the relationship between indigenous populations and refugee population, to use Evan Espiritu's work, my daughter, the refugee settlers. And I think and both of them would have to engage critical border studies and think about border as a settler colonial project. So then if we think about it as a settler colonial project, then the idea of borders is of course contentious and always in relation to power rather than natural and sacred. So I think that it's really productive to think about that intersection between indigenous populations and refugee population, both of whom are displaced, but differently. And so that's what I'm hoping to think through, and I'm teaching it this quarter to try to see what I think about it. But I do think that thinking alongside indigenous studies scholars is very productive for refugee studies.
I think that I'm going to answer this question in a completely whacked way, because Professor Espiritu has provided a wonderfully expansive, capacious, yet grounded answer. But, I am taking seriously the critical turns that are happening in multiple fields, right? And the question is, why are these turns happening right now? And I actually see that we are in a very interesting interdisciplinary moment by way of institutionalization and legibility, with regard to academic discipline, department, et cetera. And what I mean by that is that critical ethnic studies actually revises the forgetful frameworks of ethnic studies as an institutionalized model from the 1960s, right? So even though we in ethnic studies or Asian American studies always go back to 1968, quite frankly, that history is no longer relevant to kind of what exactly is happening. And that relevance or that lack of relevance is evident to me pedagogically. So when I talk to my students in Asian American literature about the civil rights movement, the rise of yellow power, et cetera, we are now talking about something that's 50 years old. And that population, right, we're talking about refugee populations. We're talking about students who are 1.5 generation students. You know, I think that we've been slow as Asian American studies as an interdiscipline to really kind of move away from that master narrative of institutionalization. Similarly, I think that for something like critical Asian studies, this is revising and rescripting the terms of a Cold War Orientalist project. So what does it mean to actually move away from Cold War formations or foreign policy and instead engage like an Asian imaginary that is heterogeneous, conflict-oriented, or complex, right? So I think that critical has actually become a very interesting adjectival modifier for a revolution or a transformation happening in various interdisciplines.
Should I? Maybe I'll add one more point. I think in terms of those intersections of disciplines, right? And the notion the with border studies, critical migration studies, and I think about the intersections coming through. Borders, but space, right? Spatially, how do migrants, refugees, people who live across borders, right, and move across borders, navigate space? And so what does it mean to be on the move? And what does it mean to have to, and this is what we talk about in the introduction to the critical refugee studies book, is like, how do we move fearlessly, right, without having to fear regulations, without having to show that we have fear, so that we can be accepted, across a border, and so I think that's the question, right? To think about, the connections between these different fields is how do we engage and center ways in which people move and live fearlessly across borders.
Thank you, panelists. So we only have a couple more minutes left, and I just wanted perhaps a minute statement or response to this call in terms of any current areas or topics within critical refugee studies that you think are exciting that you're seeing now or that should be further addressed. And that can be in the scholarship, or that could be in terms of community work. Professor Espiritu?
Yes, so just as I just stated, I do think that it's thinking about the intersection between Indigenous studies and critical refugee studies, and thinking about that in relation to space, to border, is very, very important, and displacement. Yeah.
Professor Schlund-Vials?
I think that, I will say that what I have been most struck by are projects that take seriously the comparative moves in critical ethnic studies, critical refugee studies. So it's not just about an isolated Vietnamese refugee kind of community, but it is actually about, well, what is the impact of this community on other communities? What is how do these migrations then lead to provocative and necessary comparative analyses? And I think that, that's something that's been modeled here. And Professor Vang's kind of final point about George Floyd really brings that point home. We need more of that work, because I think that all too often, there is a reliance on the ethnic enclave as a homogenous space. And that simply is not consonant with the reality of refugeness as not only fluid, but also intersectional.
Can I say
Yes.
what the project that Professor Schlund-Vials is working on, I think is so exciting. I'll just say that. And then, I've been in conversation with Kong Pa, who has also been thinking about disability studies, right? And so, I think that that's so exciting. And I have been thinking about my own mother a lot. She's on disability, right? But and I've been trying to think about her, for the past couple of years, for forever, but it makes sense. It makes so much sense. And then I think, in terms of community work, there's just so much. This is also a moment of seeing each other, right? It's such a moment of unrelenting violence, but it's also a moment of seeing each other. And I think that is where the possibility can happen.
On that note, I wanted to say thank you again to our panelists, and of course to Sarah, but to our panelists for your words and your presence tonight, and for your ongoing work, right? That, as Professor Vang so eloquently noted earlier, I have to say this work has really taught us and guided us to listen to refugee stories, right? In a way that is ethical, and that centers those lives and those experiences. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thank you.